Welcome back. In this unit, we're going to talk about what law applies to the international sale of goods. All right, in this subunit, we're going to talk about the CISG. The CISG is the United Nations Convention on the International Sale of Goods. It is a treaty among 84 nations, including the United States. In this subunit, we're going to talk about where the CISG fits into our applicable law. We know we have the common law, we know we have the UCC, now we have the CISG. Where does the CISG fit in? And we'll also discuss a very practical matter. How much of the CISG do you need to know for this course? Okay? The answer is just the basics. All right, let's talk about the CISG. Where does it fit in to our discussion of the applicable laws, the common law and the Uniform Commercial Code, right? We talked about that contract law is governed by state law and federal law. We focused on state law, the UCC and the common law of the states. The international agreement entered into by the U.S. government is indeed considered federal law. So here we have a federal law, the CISG, that will apply to some transactions involving the sale of goods. You notice that both the UCC and the CISG apply to the sale of goods. Well, which one will you apply? The CISG only applies to the international sale of goods. So if you have a domestic sale of goods, you will apply the UCC. If you have an international sale of goods, for us, if it involves the US and some other party that is in a country that is a signator to the CISG, you will apply the CISG to that transaction. Of course, we will discuss the details to this. All right, let's talk about a very practical matter. How much of the CISG do you need to know for this course? Well, there are effectively two things I want you to know about the CISG. Number one, I want you to understand that the CISG provisions sometimes differ from the UCC provisions and the common law provisions. So if we have a particular legal issue, the CISG might have a different solution than the common law and the UCC. Secondly, I want you to know when the CISG applies. Remember, we spent a lot of time talking about when the UCC will apply. Well, now we're going to spend some time talking about when the CISG applies. You do not need to know the substantive provisions of the CISG, except those that are relevant to when the CISG will apply to a particular transaction. Here's my thinking on this. If you know how the common law approaches a particular legal issue, and you know how the UCC approaches a particular legal issue, you pretty much know the approaches. And as we discuss those particular approaches, we will discuss other possible approaches. So by the time you finish this course, you will be prepared to accept any other approach to a particular legal problem. So in practice, if you run into an issue that involves the application of the CISG, you will know that the CISG is implicated, because that's what we're going to discuss in this course. And then you will be able to open the CISG, read it, do research on it, and determine what approach the CISG takes to your particular legal issue. All right? So that's it. I want you to know that the CISG may differ from the common law and the UCC, and I want you to know when the CISG will apply. All right, now we're going to talk about CISG applicability, when the CISG will apply to a transaction. Naturally, it's going to apply to transactions for the international sale of goods, but there's some more detail that we need to go into. And so we are going to look at the following provisions of the CISG. Article 1 of the CISG, Article 2 of the CISG, and Article 3 of the CISG. And we're going to look at them in some detail. After we finish our discussion of these articles, you will have a very good idea of when the CISG will apply to any particular transaction. All right, let's look at Article 1 of the CISG. Let's focus on subsection 1. I really only want you to know subsection 1. Subsection 1 says, this convention applies to contracts of the sale of goods between parties whose places of business are in different states. Here, states means nations, not the 50 states of the United States. All right, so the convention, the CISG, will apply to the sale of goods between parties whose places of business are in different states, different countries. If the states are contracting states. Now, contracting states here does not mean that the nations, that the countries are a party to the contract. What it means is that the countries are a party to the CISG, that they are signatories of the CISG. Or when the rules of private international law lead to the application of the law of a contracting state. All right, that's a bit confusing. Let's look at a couple of examples and you'll understand this better. All right, here's our first example. Party A and Party B enter into a contract for the sale of goods. Party A is in a contracting state. Let's say it is the US. Party B is in a contracting state. Let's say Party B is in China. Right? UCC Article 1, subsection 1 says the CISG will apply to a sale of goods, we said it's the sale of goods, between parties whose place of business are in different states when the states are contracting states. Okay, that just clearly applies here, so we can move on to the more difficult example. Okay, once again, let's say we have Party A and Party B, and they enter into a contract for the sale of goods. Party A is not in a contracting state. Party A's place of business is not in a contracting state. Let's say the Philippines. The Philippines is not a contracting state. The Philippines is not a signatory of the CISG. Let's say Party B is in a contracting state. Well, will the CISG apply to this transaction? The answer is possibly. Possibly. So just look at this. Some law has to apply to the transaction. The law of China or the law of the Philippines is going to apply to this transaction. Now, if under the rules of private international law just means when we have this situation, are we going to apply the rules of China or the rules of the Philippines? That's private international law. It's also called choice of law. If the choice of law rules lead to the application of the law of China to this transaction, well, China is a contracting state, and therefore the CISG will apply to this transaction. In other words, the CISG is part of the law of China. All right, we're finished looking at Article 1 of the CISG. Let's look at Articles 2 and 3. First, let's focus on Article 2. Article 2 excludes certain transactions from the CISG. So, first of all, the CISG does not apply to goods bought for personal, family, or household use. So, if I buy a washing machine from a seller in China, the CISG will not apply if that washing machine is for personal, family, or household use. And of course, that's the only reason I would buy a washing machine is for personal use. But if I am a retailer of washing machines and I buy 100 washing machines from a seller in China, the CISG will indeed apply to that transaction. All right, the CISG will not apply to auctions. The CISG will not apply to investment securities or money. We've seen the same pattern in the UCC. Go back, look at UCC 2-105, and you will see the same thing. The CISG does not apply to ships, vessels, hovercraft, or aircraft. This is different from the UCC. The UCC would apply to contracts for the sale of ships, vessels, hovercraft, or aircraft, but the CISG will not. All right, let's now take a look at Article 3 of the CISG. Let's focus on subsection 1 of Article 3. This talks about goods to be manufactured. Well, let's think back to the UCC. Will the UCC apply to a contract for goods that are to be manufactured? And we said yes. Even though this looks like it has a service aspect to it, the manufacture of goods, it is governed by the UCC. This is considered a sale of goods. Right? And there's the language. Okay, but the CISG makes it clear that even when we have a contract for the manufacture and sale of goods, it will not be governed by the CISG if the party who orders the goods, the buyer, undertakes to supply a substantial part of the materials necessary for such manufacture or production. All right, moving on to Article 3. This convention does not apply to contracts in which the preponderant part of the obligations of the party who furnishes the goods consists in the supply of labor or other services. We talked about this when we discussed the application of the UCC. Remember, we talked about hybrid contracts. We talked about contracts that involve both goods and services. And what did we say the test was? We said under the UCC, we'll ask whether the goods were the predominant factor of the contract. If the goods were the predominant factor with the services incidental, then the UCC will apply to the transaction. Here, the rule is the same, except they just use a different word. Are the goods the preponderant part of the transaction? If the goods are the predominant part of the transaction, then it is governed by the CISG. If the labor or other services are the preponderant part of the transaction, the CISG will not govern the transaction.